I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to today's session. And today we are going to be talking about warm data, and we'll be discovering and exploring the function and value of them. And my guest for today runs Warm Data Labs, and she will share her experience with them in her attempts to understand and work with complex situations and systems. She is part of a generation of exceptionally intelligent minds, and I've already had the privilege to co-create sessions with her in the context of the Systemic Leadership Summit. And I'm so happy that I can welcome her back. And her name is Nora Bateson. Now, Nora is a research designer, an independent filmmaker, a writer, and a lecturer. And she's also Gregory Bateson's youngest daughter. Nora considers herself a professional interloper as she engages in conversations in different disciplines and with different audiences, like today. One result of that is the International Bateson Institute, designed to bring together the sciences, arts, and vocational wisdoms to create a focused, qualitative inquiry of the integration of life. The International Bateson Institute is a nonprofit foundation for transcontextual research. It supports a new kind of research that encourages and incubates projects which examine the interactions within complex systems. Now, in asking the question how we can improve our perception of the complexity we live in so we may improve our interaction with the world, Nora has also developed curriculum for schools in Northern California and produced and directed award-winning multimedia projects on intercultural understanding. Now, Nora is the writer, director, and producer of the award-winning documentary, An Ecology of Mind, a portrait of her father, Gregory Bateson's way of thinking. Now, currently, Nora is traveling worldwide, holding conversations and conducting seminars with international changemakers, ecologists, anthropologists, psychologists, designers, IT people, and countless other groups. Nora's latest book is called Small Arcs of Larger Circles, Framing Through Other Patterns. And she's circling back with us. I'm really, 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 really thrilled that you're back here with us, Nora. And I'm so looking forward to having our conversation today.
Me too, Jennifer. I love our conversations. And I just want to warn our audience to begin with that we might start off with one set of questions, but we never stay with those. It seems like when we talk, things just, one thing leads to another. And I love how these conversations go. So
Yeah.
Let's do this.
Let's dive in. And just for those who have not been able or had the opportunity to see Nora and me in our conversations, we covered a lot of ground already. Previously, we covered topics like leadership paradoxes, the liminal space, the current status in the world, and we've explored new terrains. We talk about the importance of being vocal and when you're a systems worker, that we find ourselves in places where we do not have all the answers. And actually, since our conversations, a lot has been going on since then. Also, phenomenon like big complex issues, Brexit, climate change, many things, just to name a few. And Nora, I just want to start off with one of my usual big questions. And that is, we see that our old systems are breaking down. Even though these are really big political and societal systems that were not designed to question themselves, but nevertheless, something is happening. And I'd like to ask you, where are we in all this? Where do you think we are as human beings nowadays?
Oh, Jennifer. I guess what I see is that where we are is we're not where we used to be, and we're not quite where we're going. And so it's very difficult to know what kind of soup and soupy transformation we're in. I'm thinking of that stage, of the caterpillar, where it goes into the chrysalis and becomes this kind of liquidy stuff before it becomes a butterfly.
Mhm.
And so often there's this narrative around transformation and the butterfly, but it's as though the caterpillar just suddenly grew wings. And that bit in the middle where there's liquid and there's obviously at a biological level, there's information in the cells, but in terms of form and structure, um, in we're in that beginning of that liquid stage, I think, of transformation. I guess I'd like to start there because I think there's quite a bit of discussion around what is transformation
Mhm.
that isn't really about transformation.
Yeah.
It's about adjustment,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And then we get, innovation for transformation and collaborative intelligence toward transformation, and really most of it is oh, it's, there's quite a bit of rebranding and in even sort of justified by the notions of what's realistic,
Yeah.
right? What is it that's realistic to think of in terms of change?
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting question, because realistic according to which direction,
Yeah.
right? Realistic according to big banking is that we don't change very much, because otherwise big banking becomes obsolete, or
Exactly.
right. So um on the other hand, what level of kind of what needs to stay the same, what needs to change, where are we moving with this, whose ideas are holding traction with some future that's calling us, or how much of this is just the illusions that are supplied by the existing system
Mhm.
toward changing the existing system, and how can we change the existing system when we are the existing system,
Yeah.
right? So if you ask me where we are, I would say we are totally confused.
Mhm.
And really, for me, the big issue right now is this question of illusions and where the illusions are that are sneaking in and providing old patterns of thinking and justification and all sorts of other stuff.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I guess I don't think we've come even to the middle of the liquefaction process yet.
Mhm.
We're just seeing the pixelation at the edges. But
Yeah.
um, but what are we seeing? What
Mm.
are we capable of seeing? What are we not seeing?
Mm.
What are we saying now? What are we not saying? I think these are really important questions when we ask, "Where are we?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Because things are not as they were,
Yeah.
and one of the more interesting reveals, and also painful, is the reveal that is appearing around all these different formations of identity.
Mhm.
Um, and this kind of need to find the place where you belong and substantiate it, whether that's nationalism or identity that is encased in a particular community of ways of thinking or being, or expressing self. Is it about what race or religion or sexuality or age group or special interest, or and recognizing that these ever tightening notions of identity are starting to really bump into each other.
Yeah.
The paradoxes and conflicts that are generated in between these notions of identity is, I think, an interesting place to look right now at where some of the reveals are of what we're not seeing,
Yeah. Yeah.
but painful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so many things you're saying are so resonating with me, from where you started out talking about transformation and what transformation actually means. And then part of the transformation is that we do not have an underpinning for the meaning making. So also something we talked about before, about making meaning and being more sensitive um, to what we experience in the world. But the very underpinnings of this meaning making are part of also this transformation that we're in. And so grasping to our old way of identifying ourselves and our old ways of getting a sense of belonging are also in this becoming this liquid as well. And so I totally resonate when you say we are in a space of confusion when we look at it like that. So yeah, I very much resonate with your introduction in terms of where we find ourselves. Yeah.
I think that a big piece of that um, is that there are, let's say, there are populations of, I guess they're global populations, but particularly in the sort of Western civilization
Hmm.
model of what a civilization is,
Yeah.
that have been, um, a few generations now, certainly two, um, or three, of looking at the structures of our world as structures within which it was possible to be a good person.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So if I work hard and I go to school, I get a job and I get health care and I can meet someone who is also, able to help participate in the caregiving to the family, and we can share whatever ideologies, and we can share life insurance, and we can share our political views or not. At any rate, there was this notion that we could partake in our cultural patterns and we could be good people.
Hmm.
Okay, I'm saying we in this sense because actually that's the world that I am participating in.
Hmm.
And I can't say that I've been blind to it for that long. Um, but I mean, certainly for me, that was it, working in systemic work, it became revealed a long time ago.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that we are noticing, for example, my daughter says to me the other day, "Mom, I don't know how to be a good person in this
Mm.
world. Everything I do links me to exploitation and extraction and the destruction of other people's lives and the planet. Am I just a parasite? Is there any possible way that I can be a good person?" Okay, so let's think about what that means as a parent. Let's think about what that means as a early 20s person coming into the world.
Mm-hmm.
Let's think about what that means from a cultural perspective, that there is this disintegration, maybe not of the institutions themselves, but at this point of the idea that those institutions provide some kind of scaffolding within which you can find, whether you want to call it meaning or even just basic notions of uh, seeing oneself as not being evil,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is kind of heavy. I realize I dived in at a harsh angle here, but I think it's something to really consider when we're talking about what this confusion is all about and where these disintegrations are happening.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is one of them. The reveal of what, suddenly in the last 5 years, we're talking about colonialism,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we should be talking about colonialism. Frankly, we should have been talking about it all along. But it's back, and it's really important to be, recognizing that the opportunity that I have had, and that my mother had, and that my children had, and that opportunity and those possibilities are are the product of generations of comfort that were made possible not directly but certainly indirectly, culturally, through exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the trauma that I don't feel is actually not my own.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so when I'm in conversation and working with what does it mean to be thinking about systemic change, I think this is a really important question, because now we are actually at this moment, we collectively, the 7 billion of us, of being at a turning point for how much consumption can happen, what we mean by opportunity, what is material wealth, what do I teach my children
Mm-hmm.
about how to be in the world right now?
Yeah.
How do I teach my children about how to be good people? How to be good people? How do you be a good person? It's the
Mm-hmm.
most fundamental question.
Yeah. Yeah. What strikes me is that um, the notion of your daughter that she's connected to everything around her, and that within that context, it's difficult for her to find, maybe even impossible for her to find a space where she could define herself as a good person, because she's connected to all the big phenomenon that we have in the world, just like we all are. And sometimes I wonder, because you touch upon the big, and I was going to say legacy, but that's just a matter of how you frame time. Is that when we look at uh, our place on the planet, our um, generations before us who have introduced these big movements like colonialism, etc. How we shape our existence are one very big questions. And when we look back, um, we are sort of at a crossroads in terms of, are we able to carry the consequences of the choices that have been made in the past generations, and are we willing to um, make different ones from here on, knowing that we are in a context right now where we find it difficult to define ourselves. Because all those big things that have been put in place um, did not only have negative effects, they also had positive effects. And are we then willing to face that sort of paradox that it's both into existence and that it's not sustainable?
I mean, I think that one thing that clears it up for me is sort of the recognition that in terms of the notion of, material wealth,
Mm-hmm.
And cultural status that is gained by material wealth,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is much more the issue than the material wealth, frankly. If as long as we have culture that is impressed by material wealth,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to have material wealth, no matter how you restructure the economy.
Yeah.
Right. So people want to be relevant to their community, and relevance in this moment culturally is about having some sort of havingness. And so that there's a shift, I think, that needs to get made there. But if you look sort of backward from there, I think there's an argument that is basically that it's been heading here all along.
Yeah.
So this is not a surprise. And certainly my father and my grandfather and, people across hundreds, if not thousands of years have been saying, watch out for this thing, whether you call it greed or fear or some combination of these things come together or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
That, and even the notion of belongingness. And the kind of the combination of that has been guiding us in one way or another through all sorts of kind of spontaneous and emergent systemic processes
Mm-hmm.
to a Trump and a Brexit and a climate change rapid fire Greta Thunberg media blitz, that has this fringe element of Nora and Jennifer on the sidelines talking about, oh my God, what the hell's going on? That somehow
Yeah.
all of this was in play.
Yeah.
And so the consequences are that here we are. And I think for me, that question that my daughter asks of how can I be a good person has something to do with, first of all, asking that question to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Second of all, not looking for a list of rules or various kind of list items. If you do these 6 things, you will be a good person. When you're living in a complex world and you're trying to not only perceive that complexity, but respond to it, integrity has to do with not knowing and being willing to go within in those moments when you don't know, not when you do know, when you don't know
Yeah.
what integrity is, and what is the right thing to do, and where are the paradoxes. And, there's things that we're all faced with every day, right? I'm hungry, so I need to eat things, but the process through which unless you have a farm, which I don't have a farm, you're ending up buying groceries. Okay, so which groceries do you buy and how do you get there? And is it better to drive the car further to get the avocados, or is it better to eat the meat that's produced locally?
Mm.
There's like this constant questioning going on of how do I be a good person? And I think for some people it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And it's deeply interpersonal. So, my kids, for example, I definitely, when they were young, I definitely taught them to question the world
Mm,
around them.
yeah.
You know, you're living in a world that is going to transform, question everything.
Mm,
Don't take this for granted because this is not the world that it's going to be. So they learn to question, and they question me when I do stupid things, and sometimes when I do smart things, and then I get to be right, but that's kind of rare. Um, it's more often that they're questioning things that need to get questioned. Um, and then they question older generations that come from a generation in which you don't question older generations.
no.
And that questioning is a sign of disrespect, where when they're questioning me, it's a sign of respect. It is, you know, our relationship is such that that's how we go together. You know,
Yeah.
we go together kind of arm in arm, and we don't really know what lies ahead or how to do it, but let's check in. Am I showing any blind spots? Have I forgetting anything? Have you seen something I'm not seeing? So
Yeah.
in one generation, there's a whole modality of communication around integrity and respect that feels like this, that there's questioning, that there's, you know, hard work. And there's also play in that too. That's a particular kind of playing.
Hmm.
And then in another generation, there's the notion, hands off, stay pleasant, say nothing.
Yeah. And so what this tells me then is that um, when you speak about your children, it's not just about how they learned how to question, but they also learned how to um, be in context and be very sensitive to um, the interrelatedness and the interconnectedness within a context that's changing. Um, because if you're more aware of the context that you find yourself in or you're speaking to, so if they're speaking to you or if they're speaking to their grandparents, they know that's a different context and a different relationship, and that the function and role of questioning is is different, because the very act of asking a question has a different connotation, a different context, a different uh, meaning with regards to notions like integrity and what does it mean to be a good person. So, in the questioning itself, it's also the growth of being very aware of the context in which you ask your questions.
Absolutely. And you, speaking of questions, you asked an interesting question, which is, how do we learn to be in the consequences
Hmm.
of what these epochs have brought?
Yeah.
And part of that means recognizing that there's culpability. Part of that means recognizing that that culpability is not necessarily definable. You know, there's that accountability is not pinpointable exactly,
Hmm.
right? So we have had all this specification and narrowing of of jobs of specialization and so on. Um, and that makes accountability and responsibility that much narrower and that more pinpointable. But
Hmm.
paradoxically, the more you pinpoint on that, the slipperier it gets,
Yeah.
because it doesn't actually reside in one of these little boxes. The culpability resides in the relationship between them all.
Yeah.
And so actually nobody's culpable, but everybody's culpable. And there's actually no way to use the justice system really to fix it, because the justice system too is part of the processing of binary information, et cetera. So when we ask this question of how can we learn to be in the consequences of this, what does that feel like? is my question. Not what are the rules and regulations, not what is the structure, because
Mhm.
I don't think we're ready for structure. On the contrary, we're turning to liquid. So don't be looking for structure right now because we're in the process of liquefying.
Yeah.
But rather, what's the tone? What's the feel? And I think for me, one thing that has been important to recognize is to say, I don't know what to do. I don't know your pain. I cannot know your pain. Um, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to be here with you and try and explore what works and what doesn't work, what feels right and what doesn't feel right. But I'm not willing to lock it down or register some sort of protocol of what that is. And because I don't know. And
Mhm.
things are changing from so many directions so quickly that if I say, okay, this is the narrow script that's now operable, in the consequences we've generated, there's been so much pain delivered that the only way to not cause more pain is to speak in this very narrow script. Then it's a matter of seconds before all these contexts that are in operation, this is going to bring us to warm data, that are in relation and responsiveness, are
Mhm.
going to push that script out of whack and out of sync. And from another contextual position, it does not eliminate pain
Mhm.
or even alleviate pain or even avoid pain. It causes more pain. So how to live in the consequences of what has been wrought, and at the same time stay raw enough in our kind of commitment to be with each other through it,
Mm. Mm.
that we can change
Yeah. Yeah.
and change course, change script, use new words, find new angles, see new things, be in new ways. I mean, even some of the discourse that I hear now around, meaning making
Mhm.
has lost its meaning because it's gotten so trendy.
Yeah.
When meaning making is a trend, something terrible has happened.
Mm.
Oh no, what are
Yeah.
we going to do now? And
Yeah.
the same is actually true around this kind of trend of discussing grieving of our old systems.
Mm.
That somehow that's become trendy to be in a state of grief around our old systems. And if the grief is scripted, is it still grief?
Mm.
If the meaning is scripted into the trend of what it's sort of hip to say, is it still meaning? Like, things are very, very delicately woven together right now. I mean,
Yeah.
it's almost like water soluble. We make this communication and we try to create new structures, and they're just dissolving
Yeah.
before our eyes.
Yeah. I was going to say, to speak in that same sort of metaphor of the liquid. Um, the things you mentioned just now as trendy, and that they sort of um, seem to lose the very quality of when they emerged. Um, is as if they are all solidifying, as if they're becoming solid, um, in a context that, as I hear you speak, asks us to be in the liquidizing right now. And so every attempt to solidify is going to actually be a sort of almost disturbing factor in the process that we find ourselves in. It's almost like a desperate sort of attempt to hold on to the old structure just because it's something that we know. And the pattern of solidifying, of creating structures is so strong that we keep repeating it, even with the things that we find in the space of the becoming liquid. So it's like a catch-22, and it almost requires. I'm really into the metaphor here about being in the liquid. It's almost as if it requires that we learn how to breathe underwater instead of um, trying to hold our breath and keeping everything in one place. It needs to flow, and in that transformation, it's going to require things from us that we don't know, that we cannot see, that we cannot move into yet, because the process is the process. And so I find it so fascinating that every time we think that we find something that helps us, but we use according to the old pattern, that it solidifies again and brings us further from the process that we're actually in.
And then it dissolves because it has to dissolve because we're in the dissolving moment. And
Yeah.
so in working even with systemic and complexity work right now, I've been long time struggling with these ideas of parts and wholes.
Mm.
And struggling with parts and wholes because yes, we have an issue here of old thinking that is deeply informed by mechanistic metaphors. And I'm not going to go into that because I'm assuming that this audience is totally familiar with the drawbacks of the mechanistic engineered world when you apply it to living systems. It's fine when you're talking about a pickup truck, but when you're talking about a family or a culture or an ecosystem, it's not fine.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have struggled with this, particularly the language and how the language around parts and wholes brings with it these ideas that you can pull things apart. All right.
Yeah.
So if you have a system and there's something wrong with the system, that you can take the system apart and you can deal with the parts and then you can reassemble it and put it back together. So if there's something that is wrong with a child's behavior in a family, you pull the child out and you adjust the child's behavior and you put the child back in the family. If there's something wrong with the education system in a community, you fix the school, right? As though the problem were in the school and that problem weren't part of the larger community process, right? So I'm looking at how these notions of parts and wholes are actually keeping this notion of solidity
Yeah.
there. And because if you have a solid part, you can pull it out. And even so, in my work around warm data and transcontextual studies, I started using this word intersteeping.
Mm.
And I'm using this word intersteeping because when things are steeped together, you can't get them apart again. So if we think about how the education system is intersteeping with the community, there's less of a itch, an impulse to pull it apart and fix it, like you
Yeah.
would a pickup truck, right?
Yeah.
Or how a family is intersteeping. And there's not really that option I like to say you can't get the salt out of the broth and you can't get the grapes out of the wine. And, this notion that we're going to pull things apart, fix them, and then the structure's going to work.
Mm.
And this is a deep dream. And if only we had somebody who was the great tinkerer, who could actually fix the parts and jig it all back together, that then somehow our system would work and we could have transformation, but we could still basically live like we're living.
Mm.
Only it would be okay, right? So, so that's, let me make a comparison there to the gender relationship. Okay, so
Hmm.
when the Me Too thing exploded, um, after whatever it was, how many generations of that being there, somehow it became time and it entered the 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 sphere
Yeah.
of cultural discourse. And when that happened, one of the things that I saw that I was kind of worried about, and I'm still worried about, was this immediate need to think, okay, well, if we're not allowed to be like we were, what are the new rules?
Yeah.
What's the new script? How do we, engage in showing someone that we're are attracted? And what does it mean to be attractive? And what are the signals? And what are the responses? And what's the new protocol?
Yeah.
And that was an urge to get to the new solid without going through the liquid,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The alternative is this recognition that in this moment, we are dealing with so many, not only generations, but also overlapping cultures. And it's at a physiological level that you think, what is it that I desire in someone? And
Mm.
how is that, expressed through an idea of gender?
Yeah.
And what is it that I consider desirable when I'm making myself presented? And where the hell did I get those ideas? Whose
Yeah.
ideas are those? And how many hundreds of years do they go back? And
Hmm.
is it human nature, or is it culture, or is it like, what is this about? Does it have to do with ownership and predatory behavior? Do I want to be like this? It's very, very complex in there
Yeah.
around what it is that I am even perceiving in myself, in the question of what is sexy
Mm.
and desirable. Is it vulnerable? Is it strong? And what are those messages, those meanings? Where do they tag into the culture? So when we suddenly say, okay, well, the rules are going to change, there's actually a lot back there that's in a state of utter upheaval.
Yeah.
And it's a really good idea to not know right now,
Mm.
right? It's a really good idea to be in that place when you meet somebody where you are in a state of actually having no idea
Yeah.
how to deal with it.
Hmm.
Because at least in having no idea, there's the respect for all the patterns that have been in the past that have been so hurtful, but they've also been fun, right?
Yeah.
In some way, there was also, a sense of knowing what it was, and there was the game, and there was the courtship, and did he call and did she call, and what did she wear, and was it a low cut top, and all that in the heteronormative space. But it leaked over into every other space too,
Yeah.
those sexual processes. So um there it is. That's that thing again of, how do you be in the liquid? How do we be in a moment in time where we actually don't know
Yeah.
how to show
Yeah.
up? But I know this, and that is that I really don't want to perpetuate those old wounds. I don't want to be existing in a way that is partaking in continuing and supporting exploitative processes
Mm-hmm.
um, of other people, of the planet. And so intersteeping is kind of getting at that notion that you can't pull this apart and just restructure it. It's
No,
not a 1, 2, 3.
no.
It's not a 1, 2, 3. It's a deep transcontextual issue, right? That gender issue is economic, it's political, it's in our education system, it's part of the culture, it's in the family, it's has everything to do with the media, with technology. It's, it's even how we see nature. I'm not going to say it's how nature is, because I don't know how nature is. I think we got to be really careful that even when we see nature, I am only able to study the natural world through my epistemological frame. Is that what the natural world is? I don't know. What is human nature, can we say?
Mm,
Is it a good idea to say? Or does that lock us in?
right. And as we're exploring what I call big questions, because they all seem to evolve around this transformation that we're in, and the inability to identify ourselves right now in terms of who we are, where we are, um, and all we can do is look at structures that are dissolving, and some are trying to solidify again. And in this intersteeping, as you call it, and in this transcontextual, um, what is it that you do in that with warm data? Because earlier you said this is where we're getting to the warm data,
Mm.
and so the intersteeping for me is it's so interesting. It just elicits all these images within me of things that are so intensely interconnected that you can't see what's what. And so, yeah, what is it that warm data brings? What is it? And um, does it facilitate a process in which we can be with this intersteeping?
Mm. Yeah, and what do you do in an
Hmm.
intersteeping world? What's the doing,
Hmm.
right? So, I mean, I'm this word interconnected is a word we've worked hard to bring into the fore, and now it's here. And now I'm going to say it's not enough. Some things are interconnected, but most of what I think we're talking about when we're talking about interconnectedness is actually something more like interdependent, interrelated,
Hmm.
intersteeped, right? And the reason I'm calling attention to that vocabulary is only because of the baggage and the notion that if something is connected, it can be disconnected,
Yeah.
right? And um, and you actually can't disconnect things that are interdependent,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I just want to kind of bring that in as just vocabulary alert, in just looking at how deep these notions are. And
Yeah.
what happens when you start to think of a family as intersteeped instead of even interconnected?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
These ideas, these habits, these discourse patterns, the microbiome, the DNA, I mean, it's deep. It's you can't disconnect. You can never talk to your family again, but you can never disconnect from them.
Yeah.
They're right? Those relationships, whether they're in your face or not, are still going to inform everything you do in one way or another.
Hmm. Hmm. So there's only, in that sense, there's only the um, illusion of disconnecting or separating yourself.
Right. And so that's a round robin on that one, because now we have the illusion of disconnection from nature, from our families, from our bodies, from um, that we can be disconnected, that somehow education is disconnected from economy, is disconnected from um, religion or spirituality, which is disconnected from sexuality, which is disconnected from climate change. Right? So how do we actually, recognize this? And then if you do recognize it, see, the beauty of having broken the world into pieces is that then we have an understanding of doing, and the doing happens to the pieces.
Yeah.
Right? My big struggle right now is around how to reframe what we mean by doing, when what we're doing isn't to the pieces, but to the relationship between them.
Yeah.
So this is a struggle because everyone's always asking me, but now what do we do? And the idea of that doing is, how am I going to go back to my work on Monday in the education system, in the health system, in the
Yeah.
political system, and do what needs to be done there to deal with the interdependency of the world?
Yeah.
And the fact is, you can't. You can't take your understanding of interdependency and apply it to very specified, siloed possibilities of action.
No, because you'd be applying it to the illusion of being separate.
Yeah, you see, this is the problem.
Mm.
So warm data has okay. So the idea with warm data, just to bring everybody up to speed, is that it's a kind of information, um, and I like to talk about it even as a new species of information, because it's not like qualitative information. It's the notion that there are these multiple contextual processes, and that it's the relationship between those processes that's actually giving vitality to some kind of integrated living system.
Mm-hmm.
Did you catch all that? Okay,
I'm
so
trying to.
all right. So when you study a family and you want to know, you want to become familiar with that family,
Mm-hmm.
what do? You could study the individual family members, and that would be good. But until you start to study the relationship between them, you don't really understand
Mm-hmm.
that information.
Yeah.
So what warm data is it's the information about the relationship between those family members.
Mm-hmm.
But that information doesn't sit still. It changes all the time because people change and then they change, and there's all this responsiveness happening.
Yeah.
And so it's not pin downable. And it depends, of course, on which direction you look, because if you ask one member of the family what their relationship is like, they're going to say something really different than another member is going to say.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what's how do you verify?
Yeah.
Right? So then the other thing is, you're going to get paradoxes. Lots of paradoxes and contradictions. So, you get from one side of the family, I know there's a lot of people that can relate to this one, where you get siblings, both of whom are convinced that the parents like them, the other one better.
Mm.
Right? And so there's all sorts of contradictions in there. What are those contradictions? And that's relational information.
Yeah.
And because it's relational, it doesn't sit like normal analytics sit. You can't actually nail it, define it. You can't be objective. You can't measure it. So warm data is not about any of that. That's for another kind of information. When you're talking about the warm data, you're talking about entering into a familiarity across contexts. And those contexts deliver details. They deliver patternings. They deliver aesthetics, sensibilities, atmospheres, feelings. And that's what you're doing. You're looking at what's in those things, what's in those meta messaging processes, what's in the cultural blind spots, what's there,
Hmm.
um, as a way to understand another level of interdependency.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if I say a family is interdependent and I make a map of the stakeholders and I draw them all in, and then I can produce data for each one of those stakeholders, I still don't understand the family.
Mm-hmm.
I understand this like streamed in, decontextualized data on each person.
Yeah.
Right. But I don't have anything about what's in the relationship between them. So all that information at the stakeholder level is not really that interesting
Mm-hmm.
until I have the relational process. Then I can start to look, but then all that stakeholder information changes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So because it becomes relational. Are you following me?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Okay.
what's happening for me also is that, um, um, and this is not a warm data question, just to put it in that context, but examining or working with the information that comes from the relationships and the interrelatedness, um, um, is what I would call systemic. And so I'm just wondering, um, since in previous conversations we also looked at language, and language earlier we talked about can be also solidifying instead of helping to stay in the in the liquid space, let me put it that way. So how is warm data, if anything, different from looking at a family, to stay with that example, in a systemic way? Why is there a difference?
Yeah, well, the difference is that when you look even from a systemic way, when you start to produce information,
Mm-hmm.
that information generally falls into more reductionist patterns.
Hmm.
What does it look like? What does that look like? And then you start to get maps of a system and you start to get stakeholder information.
Hmm.
But very rarely do you have an idea of what's happening, especially with multiple contextual processes coming in.
Hmm. So for
Of what's happening.
example,
Yeah.
I'm really trying to grasp um uh the warm data, or the new species of data, or the new type of data in warm data, because um, for example, when I work systemically, there's different methods that I use, but one that many people are familiar with are, for example, constellations.
Mm.
And in that you sort of see the dynamics of, um, to go back to family, for example, the dynamics of a family or dynamics of an organization, where you also look at the interrelatedness. And so I am trying to figure out.
But you're
Um,
only going to get one context. So, but actually, constellations are a great example, and constellation work and warm data work go really well together.
mhm,
So that really helps. Um, but what would be another example? Okay, so you have, this is an example that I use a lot of,
mhm,
when my mom was a little kid, she went to the doctor.
mhm,
No, that's not true. The doctor came to her.
mhm,
The doctor used to come to the house. She's 90. And when the doctor came to the house, the doctor would come in and to see her for whatever, a rash or a flu or something, right?
yeah,
And And when the doctor came in the house, there was a lot of information that the doctor took in, right? Is there light? Is there grime in the carpet? Is there poverty? Is there addiction? Is it clean? Is there pride? Is there
Mm-hmm.
affection? There's a whole lot of stuff going on in there.
Yeah.
All right. And the doctors also treated the parents and the other siblings and the neighbors. And so there's an understanding of what's in the contextual process. So when the doctor then responds to my mother's rash or flu or something, that response, without anything being written on the clipboard, that response is going to include having taken in a lot of warm data.
Mm-hmm.
That matters.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So it's economic. It's very much in the relationship between the individuals and the community and the ecosystem. It's not. It's inclusive of all kinds of stuff, and it's visible and findable in details.
Right. Right.
So it's patterns that make themselves visible in details. And those things we're on the hunt for all the time.
Yeah.
When you meet somebody and you're just being introduced to them and you're taking them in, and it's very difficult actually to remember their name, because the name is kind of like a reductionism of the person, right?
Right.
Because you're not in the reductionist place. You're sensing, smelling, doing context. You're making all sorts of relational assessments, and how does this person fit into my life?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it's like, what was their name again? And usually it's the people who you kind of have the most connection with, that you have the least idea what
Yeah.
their name
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
So that would
This is
be
interesting. I really love the example, and also what you're saying right now, because what resonates for me is when I was and I am again as we're speaking. I've been part of so many different learning groups when it comes to systemic approaches and methodologies and learning. And as we're practicing as a learning group, and applying these methods, sometimes a lot of this warm data comes up, um, and then it's like knowing all the other people at a very intimate level without knowing what they do for a living, or
right.
what their family looks like. But there's a deeper knowing at different levels. And what I think I understand now, what the difference is, because you just mentioned this example also of the doctor visiting your mother, is that um, warm data is not restricted to a contained system.
That's
And
right.
so, for example, I just made the analogy with constellation work. Usually, what you do is focus on one particular system. And so, for example, if I were to work with an organization and we do an organizational constellation, then there is a lot of warm data within that, but we're not bringing in the societal context, even though societal contexts can
Exactly.
be of a huge influence on the organizational system. And I think that more and more leaders and organizations are also realizing that they're trying to solve problems in their teams or in their organizations. And they have this starting notion of the added value of systemic approaches, but they still struggle because there's also this larger context of society and the economy and politics and everything else that
Exactly.
gets reflected in their organizations. So, if I understand you correctly, working with warm data is about um, Well, as you called, the contextual.
There it is. Exactly.
Okay, clicks in for me now.
Yep, that was great.
I get it.
Was perfect. Here
I
it
try
is.
to grasp it. And so now that there's an understanding, and I'm hoping that everyone who's watching is with us right now, that I summarized it well enough for myself out loud for others to be with us, is how do you work with the warm data then? What are warm data labs, and how do you work with the transcontextual? Because it's working with so many different layers, spaces, context, however you want to call it. And it requires, especially if you're used to looking at things in a very linear way, it's like mind-boggling what you need to do to shift in order to see the warm data. Or is that just my assumption?
Well, the thing is that it's actually a lot easier than you think.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So here's my experience is that actually working with systemics and complexity for a long time,
Mhm.
like you said, you're dealing with one system at a time. And dealing with one system at a time is actually harder than dealing with multiple.
Oh, okay.
So
Interesting.
what's interesting about that is that ironically isolating a system like, the family system or the education system and trying to solve problems within that in a systemic way without taking into consideration the other interdependencies that it's within is actually far more difficult than
Hmm.
looking at the interdependencies first and thinking, oh my God, and then creating from there. Beginning the process of, okay, so what happens now from that position instead of starting with, well, here's the isolated system that we need to fix,
Hmm.
which is actually not working very well. It never has, and it never will. So the the um, the warm data lab process
Hmm.
is exciting because I have these courses where I teach people how to be hosts of warm data lab, and you can get certified, and it's my favorite thing in the whole wide world to teach that course. It's a 5-day course, and it brings together all this beautiful theory from some of my father's work in patterns that connect and double bind and schismogenesis, and then sort of history of systems thinking and requisite variety and um, uh, intermodal learning, and it's got semathecy in it. It's got just all this combination from autopoiesis to improvisation to um, Bertrand Russell's logical types and abductive inquiry, right? It's a big pack of like crunchy peanut butter theory. But but the practice of the warm data lab just allows it to just exist in our world so obviously. And what the warm data lab basically does is you take a topic that's a complex topic and you
Hmm.
start to look at what are the contexts that are inside this topic, and you let them be, and then people move through the contexts and they discuss the topic until their personal stories, their professional notionings, their curiosity, their interaction, all of these things come together, and after about an hour and a half you have a group of people who really are in the interdependency. They're in the warm data, they're right there. And at that moment, you can ask another order of question. Another whole possibility opens up of what this group can now do together. Because the impulse to solve at particular isolated, fragmented, compartmentalized levels has been melted,
Hmm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So we're in the liquid, but
Yeah.
we're in it together. And having shared that lift or deepening or whatever it is, I can never figure out the geography of where that is. up, down, sideways, of it's a substantive shift
Mm-hmm.
of recognizing that interdependency and yourself within it. And then how do we begin? Now, a lot of kind of savvy systems folks come into it. They're like, yeah, but I already get this. I already know this theory, right? I already got this. And the fact is that every time I do a warm data lab as a host, I join it. I sit down. I listen. I partake. I tell stories. I listen to stories. I'm in. Every time I learn something so substantial. I learn something that moves me and my whole orientation in life. Every time. So it's the thing is that getting into those juicy little details connects us and relinks us. And the way in which, meaning, you were talking about meaning,
Mm-hmm.
the way in which meaning is made is by linking things. And so the warm data lab is a space where we change the conditions for how things are linking. And they link in new ways. And it's like an hour and a half, and then you have a totally different starting place. So it's being used all over the world, from parliaments to inner city communities to working with kids. I've been working with people with mental illness using it. So it's activism, it's research, it's art, it's basically the process of going beyond the compartments that we thought we were living in,
Mm-hmm.
from even the way we structure our own identity, into an exploration from your humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So most systemic work tends to be about systems. And the
Mm-hmm.
system is there. I mean, constellation work notwithstanding, because that's a within. But most of the time, we're talking about the system.
Mm-hmm.
And warm data labs are an entrance into the within of that interdependency. It's a totally different um, physical, intellectual,
Yeah.
emotional
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So
It's
yeah.
it's how as you are sharing about warm data labs, um, what happens for me is that it's a very uh, uh, whole human system experience. Um, I don't know how else to call it, but it's not necessarily stepping into, because you're already there,
Yeah.
but but it's like an allowing of all the different systems and context and interrelatedness, um, in this case around the topic, um, and I'm wondering what happens if you do it without a topic, but in this case around the topic, the allowing of being in those multiple contexts and being in the interrelatedness, and that is actually the same as, and um, I apologize beforehand for the analogy, but how would you explain someone, I don't know, color TV when
Yeah.
the TV hasn't even been invented yet?
Right.
So it's like a multidimensionality uh, practice, um, compared to someone who's looking at the world from a linear perspective. And so maybe that's why it's hard to explain or find the exact words without having the experience
Mm.
with it. But I do grasp the that we struggle with the language and we struggle with words, and I understand what you're saying about the systemic, and that it's sometimes about the system is out there and we have systems thinking to work with it, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it partially takes away the power of systemic approaches, um, because we need to have language to explain to others what we're actually doing. For me, I do the experience the within a lot, like you experience the warm data labs as an within way of doing it, and that every time you are in a lab and where you participate in one, is that there's something uh, new that reveals a new thing that opens up, simply because I think that's also a characteristic of being in the transcontextual. There's no way of knowing it all, and so there's always um, new knowing and new experience emerging, new in terms of not having experienced it yourself before and not having known it before in this conscious way. But maybe it's already always been there. It's just that we haven't been able to engage with it yet.
And I think both of those things are true. I think it's new because it was there and we didn't know it, and it's also new because it's new.
Mm,
And so one thing is that I think one of the most critical experiences that we can actually provide in this moment is the experience of being kind of culturally lost
hmm
and confused. So you're engaging with somebody else's sense making process around something that you think you know what it is.
Yeah,
And you have this dislocation of knowing, recognizing, oh wow, that wasn't at all the linking that I made. And in that kind of crossing over of lots of people having transcontextual conversations simultaneously, there's an experience of really really very rapid exploration of and finding of blind spots,
mm,
which is so important. We need to find these blind spots, and and there's no way to do it by yourself.
no,
And
no,
so we have to have situations where there's the possibility for really exploring things that we thought we knew already.
yeah, yeah,
And we totally understood exactly what the systemics of education were. And then we realized, oh my gosh, I wasn't looking through the lens of sexual consent, or I wasn't looking through the lens of, right?
yeah.
And
So
or I
I,
wasn't looking through Jennifer's lens,
mm,
right?
mm,
Because you get everybody in the lab arrives with their body of experience
yeah,
and their way of experiencing.
yeah,
And so all of these differences are piling on top of each other, the different contexts, the different experiences, the different ways of talking,
yeah,
and out of that bubbles so much possibility and curiosity and integrity.
mhm,
Just to bring us back where we started, the kind of integrity that is coming out of these labs is
right,
really phenomenal, because so often when we're asking how do I do good,
yeah,
it's in one context,
yeah,
and the consequences of that good doing that aren't so good get shoved into another context, and
yeah.
then we think, not my problem.
No, I'm not
Right?
in that context.
Not in that context.
Yeah,
So the kind of integrity and also generosity that's getting um, sort of it's bubbling through the liminal space. It's all about what's happening in the liminal.
yeah,
And that is so exciting to me. And I don't know
Mm.
where it goes. I don't know what we're going to do with it, but there are projects popping up like popcorn just all over the world, from community development to um, working with, trying to get warm data in at the board level of various businesses and organizations so that they can start to think about the consequences of, things like supply chains and value chains in
Yeah.
ways that aren't linear. Hello, right? And there's warm data,
Yeah, I think it's
right?
so, there's so many things that are happening in my mind right now. One is, I think it's rather funny to move from focus on big data to warm data.
But that's how it
And
happened.
yeah, that's how that happened. And also, just to grasp and sum up that, because I think it's really important, is that with the warm data labs, there is an experience of bringing the transcontextual, the intersteeping, and the interrelatedness, just for a lack of a better word,
Hmm.
um, into an experience that then allows you to re-enter that in a combination of different contexts again. And I can
Yeah.
imagine that that's why all these projects are popping up. Um, and it's also, it's, to me, is deeply also embodiment, and it's also deeply emotional. It's also on
Yeah.
all these other layers that we normally do not access all at the same time when we're looking at a topic. And having all these multiple lenses, and as they come together in a lab like that, where you get to look through them all and use them all, there's something bigger that exists than the sum of all the lenses. Then there's the multi-contextual and the experience you have of the multi-contextual that then helps you to enlarge the multi-contextual that we can have access to. Uh,
And just name one thing that isn't.
yeah, true,
Right? So,
true.
you want to deal with health. Well, that's economic, it's cultural, it's in the education system, it's in our families, it's everywhere. You want to deal with economy? Well, economy is not about money, it's about family, it's about the ecology, it's about culture, it's about family, it's about health,
Mm,
it's about, you
yeah,
want to talk about um well, I mean, no matter what it is, it's got multiple contextual processes in it, and especially
yeah,
in terms of, community development. And this idea that you can have a room where the meta can be addressed. The meta is there,
yeah,
right? So you come into the Warm Data Lab space, you're in a meta.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so that means that the way the conversations happen is totally different. The way you talk about something in when you're in a transcontextual meta space is really different than if you thought you were just having a conversation about this one thing, and then you could drill down on it, and in that drill down you're going to get various opinions and they're going to be in conflict.
mm,
And one of the interesting things is when you've got multiple contexts, it's not so easy to create that polarity
no,
because there's no drill down,
no, no,
because you're in the meta. So
no,
in a moment when our oh my God, our political system is just suffering, and our communities are just getting choked in polarity, this is a process in which there is another kind of integrity and communication and understanding and inquiry that is outside of polarity.
yeah,
It defragments the question.
mm,
And that's just what happens. And that's pretty cool.
right,
So it's Yeah, I'm recognizing we're probably running out of time. But I think that's an important, piece, is to start to see that, every TV show that we ever watched, every rom-com, every sitcom, every everything was always about the misunderstandings that human beings make until they get more context,
Mm,
right? It's
mm,
kind of like the narrative of narratives. It's
right,
always been there. And then suddenly you see it in this other light, and it's like, oh my God, how come nobody ever said if we added context, we could deal with these conflicts?
right.
And everyone's been saying it all along.
Yeah, yeah.
So there it is. It's old, it's new,
Mm.
it's meaning making, but it's not scripted, it's not trite.
Oh,
It's
maybe it's a meta meeting making.
yeah.
Yeah. And we are running out of time, and there's one more thing I want to run by you before we close off. Well, actually, in a lot of things, but I'm going to pinpoint it down now to one thing, and that is the connection with the systems workers,
Mm.
people who um, you and I and some with us are calling forth to be more vocal. And what is it that, if anything, you would like to say to them now after our discussion, um, with a sort of underlying set of questions and context around what it means to be human, what it means to be a good person, and to be in the liquid,
Mm.
to um, the invitation to work with the transcontextual. What is it that you would like to say to systems workers now?
I think I think the main thing that I'm feeling right now is that uh, there's a lot of different people doing good work in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And there's very few people who I really feel are making an opening for a new way of being together.
Mm-hmm.
And that this to me, I know that sounds kind of woo woo, but the issue that I'm getting at is this: ambition in the field of change making or systemic work is toxic.
Mm-hmm.
We are not in this for our own betterment,
Mm-hmm.
or our own notoriety, or our, you know, keynote speech, or our next book release, or the popularity of our tweets, or, this is actually not what we need to be working on right now. And so breaking off into bits and being in competition with each other is disastrous.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also thinking that systems change is something that is remediable and is at a superficial level, I think it leads to that same kind of behavior.
Yeah.
Systems thinking is not like agile or teal or some sort of, you know, um, it's not a trend.
No.
It's a way of life. It's not about your professional work. It's about how you think about your own body and your children. That's why I'm telling these stories in our interview, that are so personal, because systemic work, it is certainly needs to be done in the external world, but not before it's been really done internally. And so that the approach is really different. And so I guess for me, those are the big ones of just recognizing this is not a technique or a methodology. It's a way of life.
Hmm.
And the sooner that level of systemic integrity is applied to our own lives, like my kid asking that question, how do I be a good person? I mean, that's the question we all need to be asking. And it comes from recognizing that she's in an interdependent system. And there's no hack, there's no shortcut, there's no way to slide out. She can, I can give her all kinds of positive fluff, but you are a good person and you just got to know it's not all your fault and you can't carry the weight on your shoulders and you just got to follow your heart. But I also have to recognize that this is my, 23-year-old daughter who is not going to submit really to any of that bullshit.
Mhm.
She's seen the interdependency, right? She's seen the edge of the matrix. She knows she's in the matrix. So what do I say to her? How do I be with her? How do I say, yeah, this is the matrix. Keep your eyes open for the cracks. And in the meantime, keep asking that question and know that I'm right behind you. I'm right here with you. I don't know what to do either, but I'm here with you. And that is so much more than trying to hack it or crack it or manage it or contend with it or solve it or analyze it or fix it or reproduce it or any of those things. So I guess that's where I am.
Yeah. Yeah. Nora, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Jennifer. I love our conversations. So we're just so hard to schedule, but when we finally get it together, it's fantastic.
Yeah, and this is our fourth one, and so let's keep on having them.
Let's do.
And as long as everyone who's watching right now is enjoying them and finding them valuable, and I'm sure that they will, especially when watching this one, then we'll keep on doing them.
All right.
So thanks for being on again.
Thanks a lot. I'll talk to you soon, Jennifer.
Yeah. And to everyone who's been watching, thank you so much for watching. And I really hope that you want to take the transcontextual further in our online community space. I hope to see you there so that we can continue this very intriguing conversation. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.